Hi, my name's Karen and I'm going to be doing a demonstration on freezer foundation piecing or freezer paper piecing. Okay, we start by transferring the pattern onto freezer paper on the dull side of the freezer paper, not the shiny side. And there's a couple different ways of doing that, and there's a couple different types of freezer paper we can use too. There's the Reynolds freezer paper, which comes in a big roll that you can get at the grocery store. I like to use that quite a bit. There are also C. Jenkins freezer paper sheets which you can run through the printer. So this makes getting the initial pattern on there easier rather than having to trace it. So there's a couple different methods of doing it. One is you can take the freezer paper, lay it over the pattern, and trace it with a pencil. I usually lay a straight edge ruler along there to get my lines really straight. That works really well. The easiest method though is just to take this to your printer and photocopy it. I've chosen one of the Dear Jane blocks because the guild that asked me to do this demonstration is going to be working on Dear Jane this year. So this is J4. Adeline's apron strings. So I took the book to my printer, printer copy machine, inserted these freezer paper sheets into my paper area, and I printed the pattern right onto the freezer paper. So it's all ready to go. Now if you're going to make more than one block, you can take extra freezer paper and cut it the same size and staple it on underneath, and you can make up to 4 patterns at a time because we're going to be perforating these lines with the sewing machine. So if you're making multiple blocks of the same pattern, then it's a good idea to use the freezer paper, stack it underneath, 4 layers, staple it on as far away from the lines as you can because you're going to be sewing on the lines. Put a couple staples is all you need. Stack them together, and then I'll show you what we do from there. Okay, a couple of things to remember when you're doing freezer paper piecing. The pattern is going to be reversed. I printed off a couple here from the internet just as illustrations. This pattern can be sewn all in one section. So it starts with section 1, you'd sew on 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, a little teeny bit 9, 10, 11, and 12. So the whole pattern can be sewn in one section. This pattern will be in 2 sections. So you sew 1, 2, 3, 4, then you sew this section 1, 2, 3, 4, then you sew the 2 sections together. Most of the Dear Jane patterns will be sewn in 2 or 3 sections, especially the triangle pieces. So one thing to remember though is that this is the back side. We're going to be working from the wrong side of the fabric. So if I were to make this is supposed to be a book, then when it was all finished, the book would actually be facing top left to lower right instead of the direction that it is. And you can see that in this kite photo. This is a kite. If you want the kite to veer off to the right, then you need to trace it veering off to the left because it's going to be reversed. And then it is a good idea to number your patterns so you know what order to sew them in. And the Dear Jane patterns will not be numbered for you. You'll have to do that yourself. Okay, so this is my Dear Jane pattern that I have photocopied onto freezer paper. This is the shiny side. This is the dull paper side. You want to photocopy it on the dull paper side. I am going to now number the order that I want to sew it in. Typically you start in the middle section, so that will be number 1. Then either triangle can be numbers 2 and 3. And then this section I'll add on a number 4. I can't go on and sew this into one section because there's 2 seams here, so this will have to be a second section. So I'll start with number 1 again, and then either triangle can be 2 and 3. So the Dear Jane pattern is all ready to go. from here, I want to trim it right on the outside line. I don't leave 1/4 of an inch seam allowance at this point. I will do that later with the fabric. So right on the outside edge, I'm going to trim this. Then I also need to cut it between the two sections. So I'm going to trim it right between the two sections. And now I have my 2 pattern pieces ready to go to sew the J4 block. Before I actually sew, though, I'm going to get some material ready. The book shows the X as being the focal fabric. So I chose my focus fabric in this red and my background fabric in the white. And I went ahead and cut some pieces so that when I sew, everything is ready to go. What I like to do is measure, for example, this number 4 piece right here. When I measure that piece, it measures from corner to corner almost 6.5 inches. You want to have plenty of fabric. So I want to make this at least 7.5 to 8 inches long so that I have enough, because I will leave a 1/4 inch seam allowance after I finish sewing this. So you want to cut your piece 7.5 to 8 inches long. It's about 1.5 inches wide, so I want it to be at least 2.5 inches wide. So I went ahead and cut that strip so that it completely covers that. I want to have plenty of fabric. You waste very little, but you still want to have enough. Went ahead and cut my pieces for the smaller X pieces so that they're big enough. And with the triangles, you want to pay attention to the bias edge. If I had cut my triangle just in half, then this would be a biased edge, which you do not want on the edge of your block. So I did a larger triangle, or a larger square, excuse me, and then cut it into fourths. So I cut it on the diagonal twice, so that the outside edge, the piece that will go right here, is not on the bias, it's on the straight of grain. And I just cut that square large enough so that when I cut it into fourths, I had a triangle plenty big enough to cover these sections. Okay, so now we're ready to go to the sewing machine. Okay, now that we have the pattern pieces ready, we're going to perforate these inside lines with the machine. So I've unthreaded the top of my machine. I do have thread in the bobbin, but you don't need thread in the bobbin. I just was too lazy to unthread it. But you need to unthread the top for sure. And you want to stitch right on these lines. And all that's doing is just making little holes right along the line, which will make it easier to fold back, because we're going to fold the paper back out of the way and not stitch through it. And by not stitching through the paper, it makes it easier to take it off later when we don't need it anymore. So you want to make sure you stitch every line on the inside of the pattern. I'll do the same thing with this one, section 2 we'll call it. It doesn't matter what foot you have on your machine. We don't have to worry about 1/4 inch seams or anything like that. I happen to have the open toe foot on right now just because that was what was on there, but it really doesn't matter. Okay, so now we'll go to the ironing board and we'll iron on our first 2 pieces. Okay, so what we're going to do now is iron on the number 1 pieces. And we want to center the freezer paper onto the number 1 wrong side of the fabric. So the wrong side of the fabric is facing up. The shiny side of the freezer paper is facing down onto the wrong side of the fabric. You use a hot iron without steam is the best. So when you're done, that's pressed on there. It's not going to go anywhere for a while. Do the same thing with section 2. Wrong side up, shiny side down. Give that a good press with the hot iron. And that one's ready to go. So from here, I am going to fold on this perforated line between section 1 and section 2. I'm going to peel that off the fabric a little bit and I'm going to fold on the perforated line. Like so. Then I'm going to take one of my triangle pieces, and since the wrong side of this is up, the wrong side of the white triangle piece needs to be up also. Then I orient the triangle the same orientation as it is on paper. The straight lines down and across, the diagonal line up. So it's oriented the same way. So it's going to be like this. I fold that back. Then I want to take my 2 pieces of fabric and put them right sides together. So they are now right sides together. And I want to make sure that there's a good 1/4 inch past here and a good 1/4 inch past here. Now I'll take this to my sewing machine and sew this. Okay, I have rethreaded my sewing machine on the top, and I'm going to sew right next to the freezer paper. That will be my guide. I do not want to start right there. I need to be sewing out into this as the seam allowance for the edge of the block or to add it onto section 2. So you want to start at least a 1/4 inch before the paper starts and end a 1/4 inch at least after the paper ends. So I'm going to start up here and I'm going to start sewing. Doesn't matter if that seems straight or not. But once you get here, you want to sew right along the edge of the paper. And in this case, I'm just going to sew all the way to the end of the fabric. Just makes it easier. I'll take this back to the ironing board and the cutting table.